Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Marshall McLuhan, the prophet of the electronic age. Together and apart, they mapped the territories where symbols live, one within the depths of psyche, the other across the surfaces of culture. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the symbolic life of humanity, one seeing archetypes as the internal structures that shape consciousness from within, the other discovering media as the external extensions that reshape perception from without. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness as it navigates between inner vision and outer expression. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and McLuhan as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in a small Swiss village on the shores of Lake Constance, emerging into a world where the Industrial Revolution had already begun, reshaping human consciousness in ways neither his parents nor anyone else could fully comprehend. His father was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, a man caught between fading faith and persistent duty, and his mother was a woman of two personalities, one conventional and proper, the other mysteriously connected to realms beyond ordinary awareness. Between these two figures, the young Jung learned early that consciousness was not a simple, unified thing, but rather a house with many rooms, some brightly lit and others perpetually shadowed. He grew up in an era when the old certainties were crumbling. Darwin's theory of evolution had shaken humanity's understanding of its place in creation. Nietzsche had declared God dead. The rationalist project of the Enlightenment promised to illuminate everything, yet somehow the darkness seemed only to deepen in the corners where reason's light could not reach. Jung's childhood was marked by strange dreams, vivid fantasies, and a sense of living in two worlds, simultaneously, the ordinary world of school and social expectations, and another world, more real in some ways, populated by figures that seemed to emerge from depths he could not name. When Jung entered the University of Basel to study medicine in the 1890s, he carried with him this dual awareness. He was drawn to psychiatry, that marginal discipline concerned with the disorders of the mind, precisely because it stood at the intersection of the material and the immaterial, the bodily and the psychic. He worked at the Burghäusli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under Eugen Bleuler, one of the great psychiatric minds of the age, and there he encountered patients whose inner worlds were utterly transformed, sometimes shattered, sometimes open to visions that seemed to come from beyond their personal experience. It was during this period, in the first decade of the 20th century, that Jung began developing his word association test, a technique that revealed how certain words could touch complexes emotionally charged clusters of psychological content in the unconscious mind. When he sent his findings to Sigmund Freud in Vienna, he initiated a relationship that would profoundly shape both men's lives and the entire field of depth psychology. For several years, Jung was Freud's chosen heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis, the one who would carry the torch of the unconscious into the future. But Jung could never quite fit within Freud's framework. Where Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, composed of repressed memories and wishes, Jung began to sense something deeper, a layer of the psyche that was not personal at all, but rather collective, shared across humanity, populated by patterns and images that seemed to emerge independent of individual experience. The break between Jung and Freud came in 1913, and what followed for Jung was a period of profound psychological crisis, a descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. During these years, from 1913 to 1919, Jung experienced visions, heard voices, engaged with figures that emerged from within his psyche, with autonomous power. He recorded these encounters in what would later be published as the Red Book, a massive illuminated manuscript that reads like a medieval mystic's journal transposed into the 20th century. He met a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, who taught him that thoughts and psychological contents could have a life of their own, independent of the ego's will. He descended into the land of the dead and encountered Salome and Elijah. He faced the overwhelming reality that the psyche was not simply personal, not simply a product of one's biography, but rather connected to depths that extended back through all of human history. From this crucible emerged Jung's mature psychology. He developed the concept of archetypes, primordial patterns of psychological experience that manifested in myths, dreams, fantasies, and the symbolic systems of cultures across the world. He explored the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness and integration of the various aspects of the self. He investigated synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested a connection between psyche and world that could not be explained by causality alone. By the time the 1920s and 30s arrived, Jung had established a psychological framework that honored both the scientific and the symbolic, both the empirical and the numinous. Jung's work during the 1930s through the 1950s, the period most relevant to our comparison with McLuhan, was characterized by an increasing focus on symbolism across cultures and historical periods. He studied alchemy, seeing in its bizarre imagery and processes a symbolic representation of the psychological transformation he called individuation. He explored the religions of East and West, finding in their myths and practices different approaches to the same fundamental human task, the integration of consciousness with the greater wholeness of the self. He analyzed the archetypal patterns in fairy tales, in world mythology, in the visions of mystics and the delusions of the mentally ill, always seeking to understand how the psyche expressed itself through symbol and image. During these decades, Jung was also observing the transformation of European consciousness under the pressures of modernity. He witnessed the rise of fascism, which he understood partly as an eruption of archetypal energies that had been repressed by an overly rationalistic civilization. He saw how the collective unconscious could possess entire nations, how archetypal forces like Wotan, the old Germanic storm god, could seize the German people and drive them toward catastrophe. He understood that psychological forces were not merely individual but collective, not merely personal but cultural, and that the task of psychology was to help humanity become conscious of these forces before they acted through us unconsciously with devastating results. It is essential to understand that Jung, throughout this period, was working from the inside out. His method was introspective, imaginative, and deeply personal. He used his own psychological experiences as primary data, then looked outward to see how these patterns manifested in the experiences of his patients and in the symbolic productions of cultures throughout history. He was a depth psychologist in the fullest sense. He dove into the depths of individual psyche and found there something universal, something that connected each person to all of humanity across time. Now let us turn our attention to another figure, born decades later and an ocean away, whose mind would take a very different path to arrive at strikingly similar insights about the symbolic life of humanity. Herbert Marshall McLuhan was born on July 21st, 1911, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, into a world already thoroughly penetrated by technologies that Jung could barely have imagined in his youth. McLuhan's childhood was shaped by the telephone, the radio, the newspaper, the cinema, all the new media that were transforming how human beings communicated, perceived, and understood their world. McLuhan's father was a real estate and insurance salesman, his mother a Baptist who later became an actress, giving dramatic recitals. The young McLuhan grew up in a household where performance and persuasion were part of daily life, where words were tools for shaping reality and influencing others. He was a brilliant student, keenly aware of language and its powers, and he pursued his education with intensity and ambition. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Manitoba, then proceeded to Cambridge University in England for graduate work in English literature. At Cambridge in the 1930s, McLuhan encountered intellectual currents that would permanently shape his thinking. He studied with I. A. Richards, and F. R. Levis, scholars who were pioneering what came to be called the New Criticism, an approach to literature that paid close attention to the text itself, to the precise workings of language and imagery. But McLuhan's interests went far beyond conventional literary study. He became fascinated with the trivium, the medieval classification of the liberal arts into grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and with how different modes of communication shaped different modes of thought. McLuhan converted to Catholicism in his Cambridge years, a move that would provide him with a rich, symbolic vocabulary and a sense of participating in traditions that stretched back through centuries. The Catholic imagination, with its sacramental understanding of reality, the belief that material things could be bearers of spiritual meaning, would profoundly influence his later media theory. For McLuhan, as for Jung, the visible world was never simply material. It was always potentially symbolic, always capable of carrying meanings that transcended its immediate physical properties. After completing his doctorate, McLuhan began teaching, first at the University of Wisconsin, then at St. Louis University, and eventually, in 1946, at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, where he would remain for the rest of his career. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, McLuhan was exploring a question that had taken hold of him. What happens to human consciousness when the primary modes of communication change? How did the shift from oral to written culture transform the human mind? What happened when print became widespread after Gutenberg? And what was happening now, in the 20th century, as electronic media, radio, television, computers were creating yet another transformation? These questions led McLuhan into intellectual territory that was far removed from conventional literary criticism. He began reading widely in anthropology, psychology, neurology, economics, and cultural history, seeking to understand how communication technologies shaped not just what people thought, but how they thought. He was influenced by Harold Innis, his colleague at Toronto, who had written about how different communication media favored different forms of social organization, how durable media like stone or parchment tended to create centralized empires, while more portable media like paper tended to favor more distributed forms of power. But McLuhan's breakthrough insights came when he began to think of media not primarily as carriers of content, but as environments that shaped perception itself. This was the great inversion at the heart of his thinking. Most people, when they thought about media at all, thought about the messages carried the newspaper story, the radio program, the television show. McLuhan insisted that this focus on content missed the fundamental point. The real effects of media lay not in what they carried, but in how they restructured human sensory, experience, and social organization. In 1951, McLuhan published The Mechanical Bride, a provocative analysis of advertising and popular culture that demonstrated his method of cultural criticism. He treated ads, comic strips, and news stories as texts worthy of the same close reading that literary critics gave to poetry and novels, and he showed how these seemingly trivial cultural productions revealed deep patterns in the collective consciousness of modern society. The book was difficult, elusive, and deliberately fragmented, reflecting McLuhan's belief that linear, sequential argument was itself a product of print culture and might not be the best way to understand the multisensory, simultaneous environment of electronic culture. Throughout the 1950s, McLuhan continued to develop his media theory, often in collaboration with the anthropologist Edmund Carpenter, with whom he co-founded the journal Explorations. They were exploring how different media extended different human senses and faculties. The wheel extended the foot, the telescope extended the eye, the book extended memory, but these extensions were never neutral. Each extension altered the balance of the senses, created a new environment of perception, and thus transformed consciousness itself. It was during this period, the late 1950s and early 1960s, that McLuhan began to achieve wider recognition. His ideas were strange, oracular, often expressed in paradoxical and provocative forms that frustrated academic critics but fascinated artists, designers, and cultural commentators. He spoke in probes and aphorisms rather than linear arguments. He leaped between historical periods and disciplinary boundaries with dizzying speed. He seemed to be describing something about modern life that everyone sensed, but no one else had quite articulated. In 1962, McLuhan published The Gutenberg Galaxy, subtitled The Making of Typographic Man, which won the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction in Canada. In this book, McLuhan traced the psychological and social effects of the printing press, arguing that the technology of movable type had created a particular form of consciousness, linear, sequential, individualistic, visual. Print culture, he argued, had privileged the eye over the other senses, creating what he called visual space, a way of organizing experience that was abstract, quantifiable, and uniform. This was contrasted with acoustic space, the multisensory, simultaneous mode of perception characteristic of oral cultures and, McLuhan suggested, of the emerging electronic age. Then, in 1964, came the book that would make McLuhan famous beyond academic circles. Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. Here, McLuhan presented his most fully developed media theory, including his famous pronouncement that the medium is the message. By this, he meant that the content of any medium is always another medium, the content of writing is speech, the content of print is writing, the content of television is film, and that the real cultural significance of any medium lies not in this content, but in how the medium itself restructures human experience and social organization. Understanding media ranged across history and around the world, examining everything from roads and numbers to clocks and computers, treating each as a medium, an extension of human faculties that created new environments and new forms of consciousness. McLuhan distinguished between hot and cool hot media, like radio or photographs that were high definition and demanded little participation from the audience, and cool media, like television or telephones, that were low definition and required active participation to complete the experience. He spoke of the global village, the new form of human interconnection being created by electronic media that abolished physical distance and created new forms of tribal, participatory consciousness. By the mid-1960s, McLuhan was a celebrity, appearing on television, consulted by corporations, interviewed by magazines. His ideas were in the air, shaping how artists, advertisers, and cultural commentators understood the media-saturated world they inhabited. He was describing transformations in consciousness that people were living through but had not yet conceptualized, and his ability to name these changes, even in his strange, gnomic way, gave him the status of a prophet or seer. But what was McLuhan's relationship to Jung? This question draws us into one of the more fascinating unexplored territories in 20th century intellectual history. McLuhan never met Jung, and Jung died in 1961, just as McLuhan was beginning to achieve his greatest influence. Yet the connections between their thinking are profound and numerous, and McLuhan was certainly aware of Jung's work, even if he rarely cited him directly. McLuhan encountered Jung's ideas primarily through their mutual influence by earlier thinkers and through the general intellectual atmosphere of the mid-20th century. Both men were deeply influenced by the symbolist tradition in literature and art, which held that symbols could carry meanings that transcended rational discourse. Both were influenced by anthropological studies of myth and ritual, particularly the work of scholars like James Frazer, whose Golden Bough explored the symbolic patterns underlying religious practices across cultures. More directly, McLuhan engaged with thinkers in the Jungian orbit. He was influenced by the work of Siegfried Giedion, a Swiss art historian whose book Mechanization Takes Command explored how technologies shape culture and consciousness, and who was steeped in the intellectual environment of Zurich, where Jung had worked. McLuhan was also aware of the work of Joseph Campbell, whose Hero with 1,000 Faces, published in 1949, drew heavily on Jung's concept of archetypes to trace a universal pattern in hero myths across cultures. But perhaps the most direct connection between McLuhan and Jung came through the concept of the collective unconscious, though McLuhan characteristically transformed this idea in applying it to his own concerns. Jung had posited that beneath the personal unconscious of each individual lay a deeper layer of psyche that was collective, universal, populated by archetypes that structured human experience across cultures and historical periods. McLuhan, in effect, suggested that media technologies created a kind of externalized collective unconscious, a shared symbolic environment that shaped perception and cognition for everyone immersed in it. The cultural situation that both Jung and McLuhan were responding to, though from different angles and at different historical moments, was the crisis of meaning in modernity. The old symbolic systems that had given life coherence, religious narratives, mythological frameworks, traditional social structures had been disrupted by rationalism, industrialization, and the general processes of modernization. Jung responded to this crisis by diving into the depths of individual psyche to recover archetypal patterns that could reconnect modern people with the perennial sources of meaning. McLuhan responded by analyzing how the new media environments were creating new collective symbolic patterns, new forms of tribal participation that might transcend the isolated individualism of print culture. Both men, in their different ways, were trying to understand how symbols work, how they shape consciousness, how they create meaning, how they connect the individual to something larger than themselves. Jung looked inward to find symbols rising from the unconscious. McLuhan looked outward to find symbols circulating through media. But both understood that human consciousness was not a self-contained, rational entity, but rather something permeable, something shaped by forces both internal and external, something fundamentally symbolic in its operations. The late 1950s and early 1960s, when McLuhan was developing his mature media theory, were also years when Jungian ideas were gaining wider cultural influence. Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, appeared in 1961, bringing his personal vision to a broader audience. His ideas about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and synchronicity were being explored not just by psychologists, but by artists, writers, and cultural critics. There was a sense, particularly in the counterculture movements emerging in the 60s, that the rationalist paradigm was insufficient, that deeper, symbolic modes of understanding were necessary to grasp the full reality of human experience. McLuhan moved in intellectual circles where these ideas were being discussed. The University of Toronto, where he taught, was a center for interdisciplinary thinking about culture, communication, and consciousness. McLuhan's colleague, Eric Havelock, was writing about how the shift from oral to literate culture in ancient Greece had transformed consciousness, creating the abstract, analytical thinking characteristic of Western philosophy. Walter Ong, a Jesuit scholar who had been McLuhan's student, was developing similar themes about orality and literacy. These scholars were exploring, in their own ways, how technologies of communication shaped the structures of consciousness itself, a theme that resonated deeply with Jung's understanding that symbols and images shaped psychic reality. What emerges from this historical context is a picture of two thinkers, Jung and McLuhan, who were grappling with parallel questions about the symbolic life of humanity, but from opposite directions. Jung dove into the interior depths and found archetypal patterns. McLuhan surveyed the exterior cultural landscape and found media as extensions of sensory and cognitive faculties. Jung worked with individual patients and their dreams and fantasies. McLuhan analyzed the collective symbolic environment created by technologies and cultural productions. Yet both arrived at the insight that consciousness is shaped by symbolic patterns that operate largely outside awareness, and that understanding these patterns is essential to understanding what it means to be human. Now, having established the backgrounds and contexts from which these two thinkers emerged, let us turn to a deeper comparison of their core ideas, examining where their visions converge and where they diverge, listening for the dialogue that emerges when we place their insights side by side. At the heart of Jung's psychological framework stands the concept of archetypes. These are not ideas or images themselves, but rather innate predispositions to form certain types of experiences, universal patterns that structure psychological life. Jung came to this concept through his observation that similar motifs appeared in the dreams and fantasies of his patients, in myths from cultures across the world, and in religious and spiritual systems from different historical periods. There seemed to be a limited repertoire of fundamental patterns: the hero, the mother, the shadow, the wise old man, the anima and animus that manifested in infinite variations but maintained recognizable core structures. Jung understood archetypes as existing in the collective unconscious, that layer of psyche shared by all humanity. They were psychological organs, as natural and universal as the structure of the human body. Just as every human is born with lungs and a heart, so every human is born with these archetypal potentials, these patterns that would shape their psychological development and their experience of meaning. When an archetype was activated by a life situation, a relationship, a symbol encountered in the world, it flooded consciousness with a particular quality of energy and meaning. The mother archetype, for instance, could manifest in experiences of nurturing, nourishment, security, but also of devouring, smothering, engulfing. The hero archetype could emerge in the quest for achievement, the facing of challenges, the overcoming of obstacles. What made archetypes so powerful in Jung's view was precisely their autonomy. They were not controlled by the ego, not products of conscious thought or will. Instead, they had their own agency, their own dynamism. They could possess a person, taking over consciousness so completely that the individual became merely a vehicle for the archetypal pattern. Jung saw this in the great charismatic leaders who seemed to embody archetypal forces, but also in the psychotic patients who were overwhelmed by archetypal imagery flooding in from the unconscious. The therapeutic task, in Jungian analysis, was not to eliminate or repress these archetypal forces, but rather to come into relationship with them. Through active imagination, dream analysis, and reflection on the symbolic manifestations of archetypes in one's life, a person could begin to consciously engage with these powerful patterns rather than being unconsciously driven by them. The goal was individuation, becoming who you truly are, by integrating all the various aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and archetypal, into a greater wholeness symbolized by what Jung called the self. Jung spent decades tracing how archetypes manifested in different symbolic systems. In alchemy, he found a symbolic language for psychological transformation. In Gnosticism, he found early Christian heresies that had preserved a psychological wisdom lost in Orthodox theology. In Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism and Taoism, he found sophisticated practices for working with consciousness that complemented Western depth psychology. He analyzed fairy tales, showing how their seemingly simple narratives contained profound archetypal patterns. He explored the symbolism in art, in literature, in the visions of religious mystics and the hallucinations of schizophrenic patients, always looking for the archetypal patterns that structured these symbolic expressions. The key point is that, for Jung, archetypes were internal. They arose from within the psyche, from those deep layers of the unconscious that connected each individual to the collective history of the human species. The outer world could trigger archetypes, could provide the occasions for their activation, but the source was always inside, in the depths of the psyche itself. Now consider McLuhan's vision, which in many ways inverts Jung's framework while arriving at strikingly similar insights. McLuhan's core concept is the idea of media as extensions of man. Every technology, every medium of communication extends some human capacity. The wheel extends the foot. The telescope extends the eye. Writing extends memory. The computer extends the central nervous system. But these extensions are not neutral additions to human life. Rather, Each extension alters the entire balance of human sensory and cognitive life, creating a new environment that shapes consciousness itself. McLuhan's genius lay in recognizing that we typically fail to see these effects because we focus on the content carried by media rather than on the media themselves. We think about what the television program is saying, not about what television as a medium is doing to our perception. We debate the message in the newspaper article, not noticing how the newspaper as a form structures what can be said and how it can be understood. This is why McLuhan insisted that the medium is the message. The real significance of any medium lies not in its content, but in how it reshapes human experience and social organization. Consider McLuhan's analysis of print technology, which he explored most fully in the Gutenberg Galaxy. Before the printing press, European culture was primarily oral and manuscript-based. Knowledge was transmitted through hearing, through recitation, through communal participation in stories and rituals. The manuscript book was precious, rare, often read aloud to groups. The shift to print, to mass-produced identical texts, created a revolution in consciousness. Print was visual, linear, sequential. It encouraged silent, individual reading. It made possible the idea of exact repeatability, that a text could be the same for every reader, that knowledge could be fixed and standardized. This print culture, McLuhan argued, created typographic man, a particular form of human consciousness. Print encouraged abstract, analytical thinking because it separated words from sound, made language visible rather than audible. It encouraged individualism because reading became a private, silent activity rather than a communal experience. It made possible modern science with its emphasis on objective, repeatable observations. It contributed to nationalism because printed vernacular languages created unified linguistic spaces. It supported Protestantism with its emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture. In short, print technology created an entire environment of consciousness that shaped how people thought, felt, and organized their societies. But McLuhan argued that by the mid-20th century, print culture was being superseded by electronic media, radio, television, computers, which were creating a new environment, a new form of consciousness. Electronic media were retribalizing humanity, creating what he called the global village. Where print had emphasized vision and linearity, electronic media engaged multiple senses simultaneously. Where print had encouraged individual isolation, electronic media created new forms of participation and interconnection. Where print had created detached, analytical consciousness, electronic media were creating what McLuhan called an instantaneous happening, a world of immediate, all-at-once experience. McLuhan's provocative claim was that electronic media were actually returning humanity to a form of consciousness more similar to pre-literate tribal cultures than to the print-based culture of the past 5 centuries. This is where his analysis becomes explicitly mythological and where the connections to Jung become most evident. McLuhan suggested that electronic media were reactivating patterns of consciousness that had been suppressed or transformed by print culture, patterns of collective participation, of mythological thinking, of sensory immersion rather than abstract detachment. In his book From Cliché to Archetype, published in 1970, McLuhan explicitly engaged with the concept of archetypes, though characteristically he transformed the concept to fit his media theory. He distinguished between clichés, patterns that had become familiar and unconscious, and archetypes, which he defined as the deep structural patterns underlying cultural expression. For McLuhan, archetypes were not primarily psychological in Jung's sense, but rather cultural and linguistic patterns that shaped how information could be organized and communicated. This is a crucial difference, and yet there are profound similarities. Both Jung and McLuhan understood that human consciousness operates through patterns that are not of our making, that precede individual experience. For Jung, these patterns were psychological, innate structures of the psyche that manifested in symbols, myths, and fantasies. For McLuhan, these patterns were mediated through technologies and cultural forms, but they similarly shaped consciousness in ways that individuals typically did not recognize. Consider how each man approached the question of symbols. For Jung, symbols were the language of the unconscious, the primary way that archetypal contents communicated with consciousness. A symbol, in Jung's understanding, was not a sign with a fixed meaning, but rather a living image that pointed towards something mysterious, something not yet fully known. The cross was not just a representation of Christianity, but a symbol of the union of opposites, the quaternity, the self. The dragon was not just a monster, but a symbol of the unconscious itself, containing both treasure and danger. Jung insisted on the irreducibility of symbols. They could not be translated into conceptual language without losing their essential power. The symbol, precisely because it united opposites and contained contradictions, could express aspects of psychological reality that rational discourse could not capture. This is why Jung devoted so much attention to dreams, to active imagination, to the study of mythological and religious symbolism. These were the primary ways that symbolic contents manifested and could be engaged with. For McLuhan, symbols operated differently, but no less powerfully. He understood symbols as components of media environments, as elements of the sensory and cognitive spaces created by communication technologies. A medieval cathedral was symbolic in its structure, its proportions, its imagery, all designed to create a particular kind of consciousness in those who entered it. A television screen was equally symbolic, though in a very different way. Its particular forms of light, its scale, its placement in the home, all shaped how viewers experienced reality. McLuhan's approach to symbols was more explicitly semiotic than Jung's, more concerned with how meaning circulates through cultural systems. Yet he shared Jung's understanding that symbols do not function primarily through their literal, denotative content. Instead, they shape consciousness by creating environments, by altering the balance of sensory experience, by providing structures through which reality can be organized and understood. Where Jung and McLuhan converge most strikingly is in their understanding that these symbolic patterns operate largely outside conscious awareness. Jung emphasized how archetypes possess the psyche, how people can be gripped by archetypal patterns without recognizing what is happening to them. The mother who devours her children psychologically does not think, "I am enacting the negative mother archetype." The man who constantly seeks adventure and challenge does not consciously say, "I am possessed by the hero" archetype. These patterns work through us, and part of the task of consciousness is to become aware of them, to see them at work rather than simply being their instrument. McLuhan made exactly parallel observations about media. We are unconscious of the media environments we inhabit because we are too immersed in them. The fish does not know it is in water. The person in a print culture does not recognize the ways that print has shaped their thinking. We notice the content, the newspaper article, the television program, but not the way the medium itself is restructuring consciousness. McLuhan famously said that he did not have a point of view because he was trying to achieve a way of seeing the whole environment, of perceiving the invisible structures that shape how we perceive. The therapeutic or educational task for both Jung and McLuhan was to make the unconscious conscious, to bring awareness to the patterns that were shaping experience. Jung did this through analysis, through the careful exploration of dreams and fantasies, through active imagination and the interpretation of symbols. McLuhan did it through cultural criticism, through the analysis of media forms, through his provocative probes that were designed to jar people into seeing their environment differently. Both men understood that this task of consciousness raising was not merely intellectual but existential, with profound implications for how individuals and societies live. Jung believed that failure to become conscious of archetypal forces led to possession, to being overwhelmed by psychological energies that one could not understand or control. He saw this in individual neuroses and psychoses, but also in collective phenomena like the Nazi movement, which he understood as an eruption of archetypal forces, particularly the god Wotan that had seized the German people. McLuhan similarly believed that failure to understand media environments led to a kind of collective unconsciousness with potentially catastrophic consequences. If we do not understand how media are shaping us, we become their servants rather than their masters. We sleepwalk through transformations in consciousness, unable to make conscious choices about how we want to live. This was particularly urgent in the electronic age, McLuhan believed, because the power of media to shape consciousness was greater than ever, yet understanding of these effects was minimal. Let us consider a specific example to see how Jung and McLuhan might analyze the same phenomenon from their different perspectives and how their insights complement each other. Consider the cultural impact of television in the 1950s and 60s, when both men were at the height of their powers. A Jungian analysis would focus on the archetypal content appearing in television programming and on how television viewing affected individual psychological life. Jung would notice how television shows present archetypal patterns: the hero, the shadow, the wise elder, the trickster. He would observe how viewers project psychological contents onto the screen, how they identify with characters, how television provides a kind of shared dream life for the culture. He would be concerned about how television might provide symbolic content that was too literal, too fixed, preventing individuals from developing their own relationship to archetypal patterns through dreams and active imagination. Jung would also consider how television affected the psyche's relationship with the unconscious. Does television, by providing a constant stream of external imagery, diminish the need for the psyche to produce its own images? Does it short-circuit the natural process of individuation by offering prefabricated symbolic content rather than requiring individuals to discover their own symbols? Or does television, by activating archetypal patterns in a shared cultural space, actually facilitate a kind of collective psychological process? McLuhan's analysis would take a very different starting point. He would largely ignore the content of television programming, insisting that focusing on content misses the real effects of the medium. Instead, he would analyze the characteristics of television as a medium. Television is a cool medium, low definition, requiring active participation from the viewer to complete the image. Unlike film, which projects a complete, high-definition image, television creates its image through scanning, through the constant reassembly of dots of light, requiring the viewer to participate in creating the picture. This characteristic, McLuhan would argue, creates a particular kind of involvement. The television viewer is not a passive spectator as in a movie theater, but an active participant, unconsciously completing the image. Television thus creates a form of tactile involvement, a sense of participation that is almost physical. This explains why television is more effective for creating the sense of personal involvement, why a political candidate who comes across as sincere and personable on television succeeds, while one who is polished and distant fails. Furthermore, McLuhan would analyze how television restructures social space. The television set becomes the hearth of the modern home, gathering family members not around a fire, but around a screen. It creates a shared experience, but one that is also simultaneously connected to millions of the other households. This creates the global village, a sense of interconnection, of simultaneous participation in events happening elsewhere. Television abolishes physical distance, creating what McLuhan called acoustic space, where everything is happening at once, where the center is everywhere and the margin nowhere. Notice how different these two analyses are, and yet how they complement each other. Jung is looking at the psychological content, at how archetypal patterns manifest through the medium. McLuhan is looking at the medium itself, at how its particular characteristics reshape consciousness and social organization. Jung is concerned with the inner symbolic life of individuals. McLuhan is concerned with the outer symbolic environment of culture. Yet both are describing transformations in consciousness, and both recognize that something profound is happening that most people are not consciously aware of. If we imagine a dialogue between Jung and McLuhan on television, we can see how each would challenge and enrich the other's perspective. Jung might say to McLuhan, "But surely the content matters." The symbols that appear on the screen activate archetypal patterns in the viewer's psyche. A show filled with violence activates the shadow, creates a fascination with the destructive side of human nature. A show about a hero's journey activates the individuating impulse, the drive towards self-realization. We cannot ignore what the medium is carrying. McLuhan might respond, "You are right that symbols matter, but you are still thinking like a literary person, focused on content. The real transformation is happening at a deeper level, in the restructuring of sensory experience and social organization." A culture with television is fundamentally different from a culture without it, regardless of what programs are shown. The medium creates a new environment of consciousness, a new way of perceiving and relating to the world. This is the primary effect, and it operates whether the content is archetypal or trivial. Jung might counter, "But your analysis remains too external." Yes, the medium shapes consciousness, but consciousness is not merely shaped from outside. The psyche has its own internal dynamics, its own archetypal structures. The medium can only affect consciousness by engaging with these pre-existing psychological patterns. Television succeeds because it activates archetypal energies that already exist in the collective unconscious. Your media theory needs a depth psychology to understand why particular media forms have the effects they do. McLuhan might reply, "And your depth psychology needs a media theory to understand why the psyche manifests differently in different cultural environments. The archetypes you see in modern dreams and fantasies are mediated through the symbolic environment created by our technologies. The hero in a television age is not the same as the hero in a manuscript culture or an oral culture. The medium shapes how the archetype can manifest. Your psychology is too ahistorical, too universal. My media theory provides the historical and cultural specificity that your archetypal framework lacks. This imagined dialogue reveals the profound complementarity of their perspectives. Jung provides the inward, psychological depth that McLuhan's analysis sometimes lacks. McLuhan provides the outward, cultural specificity that Jung's analysis sometimes misses. Together, they offer a framework for understanding how consciousness is shaped both from within, by archetypal patterns, and from without, by media environments, or, perhaps more accurately, they reveal that this distinction between within and without is itself an illusion. That consciousness emerges in the space between psyche and world, between internal archetype and external medium. This complementarity becomes even clearer when we consider their respective views on myth. Both Jung and McLuhan understood myth as essential to human consciousness, but they approached myth from different angles. For Jung, myths were direct manifestations of the collective unconscious, stories that emerged from the archetypal layer of psyche and gave shape to the deepest patterns of human experience. When Jung studied myths from different cultures, he was not primarily interested in the specific cultural context, but rather in the universal patterns that appeared across contexts: the hero's journey, the death and rebirth motif, the divine child, the union of opposites. Jung believed that modern people suffered from a loss of connection to myth. The rationalist worldview of modernity treated myths as false, as primitive superstitions to be overcome. But in dismissing myths, modern people lost touch with the symbolic dimension of existence, with the archetypal patterns that gave life meaning and depth. This disconnection from myth contributed to the neuroses and existential crises that Jung treated in his clinical practice. People could not live by rational understanding alone. They needed myth, needed connection to something larger than their personal ego, needed the sense of participating in eternal patterns. Jung's therapeutic work often involved helping patients reconnect with mythological themes. He would show them how their personal struggles recapitulated ancient mythological patterns, how their depression might be understood as a descent into the underworld, how their relationship difficulties might involve the anima or animus, how their midlife crisis was a version of the hero's journey. By seeing their lives in mythological terms, patients could find meaning in their suffering, could feel part of a larger story rather than isolated in meaningless struggle. McLuhan approached myth very differently, yet arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about its importance. For McLuhan, myth was a form of knowledge characteristic of oral cultures, cultures without writing or with limited literacy. In oral cultures, knowledge had to be preserved in memory, passed down through recitation and ritual. Myths were mnemonic devices, ways of encoding essential cultural knowledge in memorable stories. But they were more than just storage systems. The mythological mode of thought was simultaneous, involving all the senses, participatory rather than detached, concerned with patterns and resonances rather than linear causation. McLuhan argued that literacy, and especially print, had pushed mythological thinking to the margins of consciousness, replacing it with abstract, analytical, linear modes of thought. Print culture created what he called the Gutenberg man, whose consciousness was visual, sequential, detached. But McLuhan believed that electronic media were retribalizing humanity, bringing back forms of consciousness more similar to pre-literate cultures. Television, radio, and later computers were creating a new form of mythological consciousness, not through traditional myths, but through the immersive, all-at-once quality of electronic experience. McLuhan suggested that Advertising, popular culture, and mass media were creating new myths, new shared stories, and symbols that functioned for modern culture the way traditional myths functioned for oral societies. These new myths were not necessarily profound or life-affirming in the way that traditional myths had been, but they played a similar role in creating shared symbolic frameworks through which people understood their world. The Marlboro Man, the American Dream, the Space Age, these were modern myths, symbolic narratives that shaped collective consciousness. Where McLuhan and Jung converge is in their understanding that myth operates at a level deeper than rational discourse, that it shapes consciousness in ways that cannot be reduced to literal meanings or logical arguments. Both believe that the modern attempt to eliminate myth in favor of pure rationality was not only impossible but dangerous, because it left people disconnected from the symbolic dimension of existence. Both saw the return or persistence of myth in the 20th century, Jung in the unconscious manifestations of archetypal patterns, McLuhan in the new tribal consciousness created by electronic media. But their prescriptions differed. Jung's therapeutic approach was to help individuals develop a personal relationship with archetypal patterns through dream work, active imagination, and the exploration of symbolic content. He wanted people to create their own myths, their own symbolic expressions of the individuation process. He was suspicious of collective movements and mass phenomena because he saw how easily they became vehicles for unconscious archetypal possession, as in fascism. McLuhan's approach was more descriptive than prescriptive. He wanted people to become aware of the media environments shaping their consciousness, to understand the effects of the technologies they used. He was less concerned with individual therapeutic work and more interested in cultural education, in helping people see the invisible structures that shaped collective consciousness. He oscillated between optimism about the new forms of global consciousness being created by electronic media and concern about the dangers of unconsciously surrendering to technological determinism. Another crucial point of comparison between Jung and McLuhan lies in their understanding of the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. Jung distinguished sharply between the personal unconscious, the repository of repressed memories, forgotten experiences, and personal complexes, and the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of psyche shared by all humanity and populated by archetypes. The personal unconscious was unique to each individual, while the collective unconscious was universal. This distinction was essential to Jung's entire psychological framework. It explained why certain symbols and images appeared universally, why myths from different cultures shared similar patterns, why patients who knew nothing of alchemy or Gnosticism would spontaneously produce similar imagery. The collective unconscious was not learned or transmitted culturally. It was innate, part of the inherited structure of the human psyche. Yet Jung also understood that the collective unconscious could only manifest through individuals, that archetypes only became visible when they took on form in particular personal and cultural contexts. The mother archetype was universal, but every mother and every experience of mothering was unique. The challenge was to understand both dimensions, to see the universal pattern and the unique personal expression, to honor both the collective and the individual. McLuhan's framework inverted this in intriguing ways. He was less concerned with the individual as such and more focused on collective symbolic environments. His unit of analysis was not the individual psyche, but the cultural environment created by media technologies. Individual consciousness, in McLuhan's view, was largely a product of these collective media environments. The typographic man of print culture was not a conscious choice made by individuals, but rather an emergent property of the print environment. People thought linearly, abstractly, and individually because they lived in a print-based cultural space. This might seem to minimize individual agency, to make consciousness merely a product of external technological forces, but McLuhan would counter that this actually describes how consciousness has always operated, though people in print culture developed the illusion of autonomous individual consciousness precisely because print encourages individualism. Electronic media, by retribalizing consciousness, make visible the collective nature of all consciousness, the ways that individual minds are always embedded in and shaped by shared symbolic environments. If we imagine Jung and McLuhan in dialogue on this question of individual versus collective consciousness, we might envision a productive tension. Jung would insist on the reality of the individual psyche, on the uniqueness of each person's individuation process. He would argue that while we all share the collective unconscious, the task of each life is to discover one's particular way of relating to these universal patterns, to become who you uniquely are rather than simply being an instance of collective patterns. McLuhan might respond that this very idea of the autonomous individual is itself a product of print culture, that it would not have been conceivable in an oral culture or in the emerging electronic culture. He might argue that Jung's emphasis on individuation reflects the values of a particular media environment rather than a universal truth about human consciousness. In a different media environment, with different technologies shaping consciousness, the goal might not be individuation but participation, not differentiation but connection. Yet both would agree on the fundamental point that consciousness is not isolated, not purely individual, but rather always participatory, always existing in relationship to something larger. For Jung, this larger something was the collective unconscious, and ultimately the self, the totality of psyche that transcended the ego's limited perspective. For McLuhan, this larger something was the media environment, the collective symbolic space created by communication technologies. Their disagreement, if we can call it that, is about whether the structures that shape consciousness are primarily internal and universal, as Jung believed, or primarily external and historically variable, as McLuhan believed. But perhaps this disagreement is less fundamental than it appears. Perhaps what we are seeing in their different frameworks are two complementary ways of describing a single reality that consciousness emerges in the space between internal potentials and external environments, that archetypes in media are two sides of a single symbolic process. This becomes clearer when we consider their respective approaches to what might be called the problem of consciousness in modernity. Both Jung and McLuhan were responding to a crisis of consciousness in the 20th century, a sense that modern people were profoundly disoriented, disconnected from sources of meaning, vulnerable to destructive collective movements. Jung diagnosed this crisis in terms of the split between consciousness and the unconscious. Modern rationalism had inflated the ego, had created the illusion that consciousness was self-sufficient, that reason alone could provide guidance for life. This inflation of consciousness created a corresponding devaluation of the unconscious, a denial of the symbolic and irrational dimensions of psyche. The result was neurosis on the individual level and cultural catastrophe on the collective level. The archetypal forces that were denied and devalued did not simply disappear. Instead, they erupted in destructive forms, in neurotic symptoms, in mass movements, in the wars and genocides that marked the 20th century. Jung's therapeutic response was to help people reconnect with the unconscious, to establish a dialogue between consciousness and the deeper layers of psyche. This required learning to attend to dreams, to engage with symbolic imagery, to recognize the archetypal patterns operating in one's life. It meant developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites and allow a third thing to emerge that transcended the original opposition. McLuhan diagnosed the crisis somewhat differently, in terms of the gap between our technologies and our awareness of them. We had created electronic media that were fundamentally altering consciousness and social organization, but we remained unaware of these effects because we were still thinking in the categories of print culture. We focused on content while ignoring the environmental effects of media themselves. This unconsciousness about our media environment made us vulnerable to the very technologies we had created, turning us into their servants rather than their masters. McLuhan's response was to develop what he called awareness of process, the capacity to see the media environment itself rather than being absorbed entirely in content. This required a kind of figure ground reversal, making the invisible visible, attending to the medium as well as the message. McLuhan's provocative, aphoristic style was designed to jolt people into this new awareness, to make them see differently. Despite the different diagnoses, both Jung and McLuhan were calling for essentially the same thing, a more conscious relationship to the forces shaping consciousness. Both believed that the primary danger facing humanity was not external enemies, but rather unconsciousness, the failure to recognize and understand the forces operating within and upon us. Both believed that consciousness itself, awareness itself, was the primary therapeutic and educational task. This shared emphasis on consciousness is crucial because it reveals that despite their differences, Jung and McLuhan were both fundamentally concerned with the same existential question. How can human beings live more consciously, more aware of what shapes their experience, more capable of making genuine choices rather than simply being driven by forces they do not understand? For Jung, this meant becoming conscious of the archetypes operating within. For McLuhan, this meant becoming conscious of the media environments operating without. But both understood that such consciousness was rare, difficult, and absolutely essential. Let us consider one more crucial point of comparison, this time regarding their understanding of transformation and change. Jung's concept of individuation described a lifelong process of psychological development, a journey toward wholeness and integration. Individuation was not something that could be achieved once and for all, but rather an ongoing engagement with the unconscious, a continual integration of new contents and deeper layers of psyche. Jung understood individuation as following certain typical patterns: the confrontation with the shadow, the encounter with the anima or animus, the discovery of the self. But he also insisted that each person's individuation was unique. The archetypes provided the universal structures, but the specific content and sequence varied for each individual. Moreover, individuation often involved suffering, crisis, and descent before any higher integration became possible. The midlife crisis, psychological breakdown, the dark night of the soul, these painful experiences were often necessary stages in the individuation process. Jung also believed that individuation had a collective dimension. As individuals became more conscious, more integrated, they contributed to the consciousness of humanity as a whole. The work of individuation was not just personal, but also cultural and spiritual. Those who undertook the difficult work of becoming conscious were, in a sense, doing this work on behalf of the whole human species. McLuhan had a very different framework for understanding transformation, focused not on individual development, but on cultural and technological change. He described historical shifts in consciousness created by the introduction of new communication technologies, the shift from oral to manuscript culture, the transformation brought by the printing press, the electronic revolution. These were massive transformations in how entire cultures perceived, thought, and organized themselves. McLuhan's historical vision was not linear, but rather cyclical or spiral. He saw the electronic age as returning humanity to forms of consciousness similar to pre-literate oral cultures, but at a higher level of organization. We were being retribalized, reconnected to simultaneous, multisensory, participatory modes of consciousness that print culture had suppressed. But this was not simply a regression to primitive consciousness. It was a return with a difference, incorporating all that had been learned in the intervening print centuries. McLuhan was characteristically ambiguous about whether these transformations were progressive or not. He resisted the role of prophet or moral guide, insisting that his task was simply to describe the changes happening to make the invisible visible. Yet there were clearly normative dimensions to his thinking. He valued awareness over unconsciousness, understanding over blindness to process. He worried about the destructive potential of technologies that we did not understand, and he suggested that becoming conscious of media environments might allow us to have some choice about how we use technologies, rather than simply being used by them. If Jung and McLuhan were to discuss the question of transformation and change, they would find both common ground and significant differences. Both understood that consciousness evolves, that human beings are not static but rather capable of profound transformation. Both believed that such transformation was urgently needed in the modern world, that the old structures of consciousness were inadequate to the challenges we faced. But Jung focused on individual transformation that could then contribute to collective change, while McLuhan focused on collective transformation that shaped individual consciousness. Jung believed in the possibility of genuine individual agency and choice in the individuation process. McLuhan was more ambiguous, sometimes seeming to suggest that consciousness was largely determined by media environments, though he also insisted that awareness of this determination could provide a kind of freedom. Their different emphases reflect their different starting points and methodologies. Jung was fundamentally a clinician, working with individual patients, exploring the unique contours of each psyche. His theories emerged from this clinical work, from his careful attention to the symbolic productions of individuals. McLuhan was fundamentally a cultural critic, surveying the collective symbolic landscape, analyzing the large-scale patterns that shaped entire cultures. His theories emerged from this wide-ranging cultural analysis. Yet both men, in their different ways, were mystic seers who perceived dimensions of reality that most people missed. Jung saw the archetypal depths beneath the surface of consciousness. McLuhan saw the media environments that surrounded and shaped consciousness. Both developed forms of vision that penetrated beyond the obvious, beyond what was immediately visible, to reveal the hidden structures and forces at work. This mystical dimension of their thinking is crucial to understand. Neither Jung nor McLuhan was content with purely external behaviorist or mechanistic explanations of human consciousness. Both understood that consciousness was mysterious, that it involved dimensions that could not be fully captured by scientific measurement or rational analysis. Both used metaphor, poetry, and imaginative leaps in their thinking because they were trying to point toward realities that could not be fully articulated in literal language. Jung's mysticism was explicit. He wrote extensively about synchronicity, about meaningful coincidences that suggested connections between psyche and world that transcended causality. He explored his own visionary experiences, the encounters with figures like Philemon that seemed to come from beyond his personal psyche. He engaged deeply with alchemical, Gnostic, and Eastern spiritual traditions that offered symbolic languages for psychological realities. While Jung insisted that he was a scientist and empiricist, his empiricism included the subjective data of inner experience, and his science was always in dialogue with the numinous, the sacred, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. McLuhan's mysticism was perhaps less obvious, but no less real. His Catholic faith provided a sacramental framework, a sense that the material world was always potentially revelatory of spiritual realities. His media theory, with its emphasis on how technologies extend and reshape human consciousness, had a quasi-mystical quality, treating media as forces that operate at a level beyond rational control. His aphoristic style, his refusal of linear argument, his use of probes and provocations, all this reflected his sense that he was trying to point toward realities that could not be captured in conventional academic discourse. Both men were comfortable with paradox, with contradictions that could not be resolved through logic alone. Jung embraced the union of opposites as a central principle of psychic life. Consciousness and unconscious, male and female, light and shadow, all needed to be held together in a higher integration. McLuhan delighted in paradoxical formulations. The medium is the message. We look at the present through a rear-view mirror. The content of a medium is always another medium that were designed to twist perception, to force a new way of seeing. This comfort with paradox and mystery sets both Jung and McLuhan apart from more conventional, reductionist approaches to psychology and communication theory. Neither was interested in explaining consciousness away, in reducing psyche to biology, or consciousness to information processing. Instead, both wanted to expand our sense of what consciousness is, to reveal its depths and dimensions, to show how it participates in realities larger than the individual ego. As we move toward the contemplative and reflective dimension of our exploration, it is worth pausing to consider what emerges when we hold Jung and McLuhan together in our awareness, when we allow their different visions to illuminate each other. What do we see about consciousness, about symbols, about the human condition when we view it through both their frameworks simultaneously? We begin to see that consciousness exists in a space between inner and outer, between psyche and world, between archetype and medium. It is not purely internal, not a self-contained entity sealed off from the world, nor is it purely external, simply a product of environmental conditioning. Rather, consciousness emerges in the dynamic interplay between internal potentials and external environments, between the archetypal structures that Jung mapped and the media environments that McLuhan described. The symbols that shape consciousness have both an inner and an outer dimension. They arise from the depths of the collective unconscious, as Jung showed, carrying the weight of human evolutionary history. But they also circulate through cultural and technological systems, as McLuhan demonstrated, taking on particular forms and effects depending on the media that carry them. A symbol is simultaneously an internal psychological reality and an external cultural form, and it is in the space between these that meaning emerges. Consider the symbol of the cross. From Jung's perspective, The cross is an archetypal symbol of wholeness, a quaternary structure that represents the integration of opposites, the vertical and horizontal, the spiritual and material, the transcendent and immanent. It appears across cultures in various forms: the medicine wheel, the mandala, the four directions, because it expresses an archetypal pattern in the collective unconscious. When an individual encounters the cross symbol, it activates this archetypal potential, connecting personal experience with universal pattern. From McLuhan's perspective, the cross is also a medium, a form of cultural communication that has been extended through various technologies, carved in stone, printed in books, broadcast in electronic media. Each medium through which the cross is transmitted changes how it is experienced and what it means. The stone cross of medieval Christianity creates a different consciousness than the printed cross in a Protestant Bible or the neon cross on a televised evangelical program. The medium shapes the experience of the symbol. Both perspectives are true and necessary. The cross works as a symbol because it activates archetypal patterns in the psyche. But how it works, what specific effects it has, depends on the media environment through which it is transmitted. The symbol has depth, reaching into the collective unconscious, but it also has historical and cultural specificity, shaped by technologies and media forms. To understand symbols fully, we need both the vertical depth of Jung's archetypal psychology and the horizontal breadth of McLuhan's media theory. This integrated perspective has profound implications for understanding contemporary consciousness. We live in an age of unprecedented media saturation, surrounded by screens, immersed in electronic environments that McLuhan could only begin to imagine. The internet, social media, smartphones, virtual reality, these technologies are creating new forms of consciousness, new ways of perceiving and relating to reality. At the same time, we are witnessing a resurgence of interest in mythology, symbolism, spirituality, and depth psychology, a hunger for the archetypal dimensions that Jung explored. These two phenomena, the technological transformation of consciousness and the renewed interest in depth and meaning, are not unrelated. They are two aspects of a single process, the transformation of consciousness in our time. The electronic media that McLuhan analyzed have created a global symbolic environment of unprecedented complexity and reach. But this environment is not neutral. It activates archetypal patterns, stirs up contents from the collective unconscious, creates conditions in which mythological and symbolic dimensions of experience become more rather than less important. Jung would recognize in our contemporary media landscape the same archetypal forces he saw throughout history, but now amplified and accelerated by technology. The hero narratives in films and video games, the shadow projections in political discourse, the search for meaning in a disenchanted world, these are all expressions of archetypal needs and patterns. But these patterns are now mediated through technologies that shape how they manifest and what effects they have. McLuhan would recognize in our contemporary psychological landscape the effects of media transformation that he predicted. The simultaneous, all-at-once quality of electronic media has created what he called acoustic space, a form of consciousness that is more participatory, more tribal, more immediate than the linear, detached consciousness of print culture. This is why mythology, with its nonlinear, multidimensional narratives, feels more relevant now than it did in the height of print culture. The media environment has shifted in ways that make archetypal and mythological consciousness more accessible, more native to our experience. Together, Jung and McLuhan help us understand that the symbols we encounter in our dreams, in our media, in our cultural discourse, operate at multiple levels simultaneously. They have psychological depth, activating archetypal patterns in the unconscious. They have cultural breadth, circulating through media systems and shaping collective consciousness. They have historical specificity, taking on particular forms and meanings in particular contexts. And they have transformative power, capable of reshaping individual and collective consciousness in profound ways. This understanding invites us to approach symbols with a kind of double vision, attending to both their inner and outer dimensions, both their universal and particular aspects. When we encounter a powerful symbol in a dream, in a film, in a political movement, we can ask both Jungian and McLuhanian questions. What archetypal pattern is being activated? What unconscious contents are being constellated? And also, through what media is this symbol being transmitted? How does the medium shape the experience of the symbol? What kind of consciousness does this particular media form encourage or discourage? This double questioning enriches both perspectives. The Jungian approach gains historical and cultural specificity by attending to media forms. The McLuhanian approach gains psychological depth by attending to archetypal patterns. Together, they offer a more complete understanding of the symbolic life of consciousness than either provides alone. Consider how this integrated perspective might illuminate the phenomenon of social media, something that neither Jung nor McLuhan lived to fully experience, but which both their frameworks can help us understand. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok have transformed how billions of people communicate, perceive, and relate to each other. They have created what is arguably the most powerful collective symbolic environment in human history, a global media space where symbols circulate with unprecedented speed and reach. From a Jungian perspective, social media is a space where archetypal patterns manifest and compete for attention. The persona, the mask we present to the world, becomes hypertrophied as people carefully curate their online identities. The shadow, the rejected and denied aspects of psyche, gets projected onto others with frightening intensity, as online discourse becomes a battleground of mutual demonization. The need for meaning and connection, for participation in something larger than oneself, gets channeled into viral movements and online communities that take on quasi-religious intensity. The archetypal forces that Jung identified, the hunger for the numinous, the power of the collective, the danger of possession by unconscious contents, all manifest in social media, but in accelerated and intensified forms. The relative anonymity and distance of online interaction can allow archetypal forces to erupt with less ego control than face-to-face interaction requires. The echo chamber effect can create collective unconsciousness, where groups become possessed by particular archetypal patterns and lose the capacity for self-reflection or dialogue with other perspectives. From a McLuhanian perspective, social media represents a new form of medium with particular characteristics that shape consciousness in specific ways. Social media platforms are cool media, requiring active participation to create content and meaning. They are multisensory, engaging vision, text, sound, and the tactile dimension of scrolling and tapping. They create a form of acoustic space where information comes from all directions simultaneously, where the center is everywhere and the margin nowhere. Social media retribalizes us in the way McLuhan predicted electronic media would, creating new forms of collective identity and participation. But the tribes are no longer defined by geography or even by culture in the traditional sense. They are defined by attention, by algorithms, by the networks of connection and communication that platforms create. Social media makes everyone a producer as well as consumer of content, democratizing media production in ways that transform the relationship between creator and audience. The medium of social media encourages certain forms of consciousness and discourages others. It favors the brief, the immediate, the emotional over the long, the reflective, the rational. It creates what has been called the attention economy, where consciousness is fragmented into discrete units of engagement, measured in likes, shares, and comments. It enables connection while potentially limiting depth, creating what Sherry Turkle has called being alone together, simultaneously connected to many and deeply present to none. When we combine the Jungian and McLuhanian perspectives on social media, we get a richer picture. We see that social media is not just a neutral platform for communication, but rather a powerful, symbolic environment that activates archetypal patterns while simultaneously shaping how those patterns can manifest. The medium and the archetype interact, creating emergent forms of consciousness that are neither purely technological nor purely psychological, but rather born from the intersection of the two. This integrated understanding helps us approach social media and all media with greater awareness and wisdom. We can recognize the archetypal needs that draw us to these platforms, the need for connection, for meaning, for participation, for expression, while also recognizing how the particular characteristics of the medium shape and sometimes distort the fulfillment of these needs. We can work to bring more consciousness to our media use, making choices about when and how we engage, rather than simply being swept along by the algorithm's current. The task of consciousness that both Jung and McLuhan called for becomes even more urgent in our contemporary media landscape. We need the capacity to observe our own experience, to notice when we are being gripped by archetypal forces or shaped by media environments in ways that diminish rather than enhance our humanity. We need to develop what might be called symbolic literacy, the ability to read and interpret the symbols that surround us, understanding both their archetypal depth and their mediated forms. This symbolic literacy requires cultivating several capacities. First, the capacity for introspection and self-reflection that Jung emphasized, the ability to attend to our own inner experience, our dreams, our fantasies, our emotional responses, and to see in them the patterns and forces operating beneath conscious awareness. This means taking time for silence and solitude, for the kind of inward attention that our media-saturated culture often discourages. Second, the capacity for environmental awareness that McLuhan emphasized, the ability to step back from our immersion in media environments and see them as environments, as structures that shape perception and consciousness. This means developing the kind of figure-ground reversal that can make the invisible visible, that can attend to the medium as well as the message. Third, the capacity to hold both perspectives simultaneously, to see how inner and outer, archetype and medium, psyche and world interpenetrate and shape each other. This requires a kind of stereoscopic vision, a doubled awareness that can perceive both dimensions at once. Developing these capacities is not easy. It goes against the grain of both our psychological tendencies and our cultural conditioning. Psychologically, we are inclined to unconsciousness, to being absorbed in whatever grips our attention, whether that be an inner obsession or an outer spectacle. Culturally, we are surrounded by media environments that encourage this absorption, that profit from our unconsciousness, that are designed to capture and hold our attention without encouraging reflection on the means by which they do so. Yet both Jung and McLuhan believed that consciousness, however difficult to achieve, was not only possible, but essential. They both devoted their lives to making the unconscious conscious, to bringing awareness to the forces that shape experience. And they both believed that this work of consciousness had not just personal but collective significance, that those who become more aware contribute to the awareness of humanity as a whole. This brings us to a deeper question that both Jung and McLuhan grappled with. What is consciousness for? Why should we make the effort to become more aware? What is gained by understanding the archetypal forces within and the media environments without? For Jung, consciousness was not just an intellectual achievement, but a moral and spiritual necessity. Becoming conscious meant taking responsibility for one's own psychic contents rather than projecting them onto others. It meant integrating the shadow rather than enacting it unconsciously. It meant developing a relationship with the self, that center and totality of psyche that transcended ego consciousness. The goal was not just personal happiness or adjustment, but rather wholeness, individuation, the realization of one's unique nature in harmony with the greater totality. Jung believed that consciousness had a cosmic significance. In his late work, particularly in Answer to Job, and in his autobiography, he suggested that the creation of consciousness might be the purpose of creation itself, that God or the self or the totality of being needed human consciousness in order to become aware of itself. This was a radical vision that put tremendous weight on the human task of becoming conscious. We were not just working out our personal problems or achieving individual fulfillment. We were participating in the self-realization of the cosmos. For McLuhan, consciousness served a somewhat different function. Understanding media environments allowed us to have some choice about how we use technologies rather than simply being used by them. Awareness of the effects of media could protect us from the worst consequences of technological change and might allow us to shape our media environments in more humane directions. While McLuhan was typically reluctant to make explicit value judgments, there was clearly an ethical dimension to his project. Unconsciousness about media makes us vulnerable to manipulation and control, while awareness creates the possibility of freedom. McLuhan also suggested that understanding media was necessary for cultural survival. Technologies were so powerful in reshaping consciousness and social organization that cultures which did not understand these effects were at risk of being overwhelmed by changes they could not comprehend. The ability to see the effects of media, to maintain some awareness of how technologies were transforming human life, might make the difference between creative adaptation and destructive disruption. Despite their different emphases, both Jung and McLuhan arrived at similar conclusions. Consciousness is valuable because it creates freedom and responsibility. Unconsciousness means being driven by forces we do not understand, whether those forces are archetypal patterns erupting from within or technological effects operating from without. Consciousness means seeing these forces at work and thus having some possibility of relating to them consciously, of making choices about how we respond rather than simply being their vehicle. This understanding has profound implications for how we live. It suggests that the examined life, the conscious life, is not a luxury or an intellectual hobby, but rather a necessity for human flourishing and perhaps even survival. In a world of powerful media technologies and turbulent archetypal energies, unconsciousness is dangerous to ourselves, to others, to the human project as a whole. Consciousness, however difficult to achieve, is the essential human task. But what does it mean, practically, to live more consciously in light of Jung's and McLuhan's insights? How do we cultivate the capacity to be aware of both the archetypal forces within and the media environments without? How do we develop the double vision that can perceive both dimensions simultaneously? Both men offered practices and methods, though their approaches differed. Jung developed specific techniques for working with the unconscious: dream interpretation, active imagination, the analysis of transference, the study of symbols and myths. These were not just intellectual exercises, but rather experiential practices designed to create a living relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The goal was not to eliminate the unconscious or fully control it, but rather to establish a dialogue, a back-and-forth exchange that could gradually integrate unconscious contents into consciousness. Dream work was particularly central to Jung's method. Dreams, he believed, were spontaneous productions of the unconscious, offering images and narratives that compensated for the one-sidedness of conscious attitudes. By attending to dreams, recording them, associating to their images, and trying to understand what they might be communicating, one could maintain ongoing contact with the unconscious. Dreams were a natural, nightly reminder that consciousness was not the whole story, that there were depths and dimensions beyond ego awareness. Active imagination was another key practice. This involved entering into dialogue with unconscious contents, with dream figures, with emotions, with inner voices, treating them as autonomous entities with their own perspectives and agency. Through active imagination, one could encounter the archetypal forces that Jung had discovered in his own confrontation with the unconscious. This was not mere fantasy or daydreaming, but rather a disciplined practice of allowing unconscious contents to manifest and engaging with them consciously. Jung also emphasized the importance of understanding one's life symbolically, seeing the patterns and meanings that ran through personal history. This meant looking for recurring themes, for symptoms and synchronicities that might be trying to communicate something, for the ways that archetypal patterns manifested in relationships and life choices. It meant treating one's life as a text to be interpreted, a story whose full meaning might only become clear over time. McLuhan's practices were less explicitly methodological, but they were no less important. His central practice was what might be called critical awareness of media, the cultivation of the capacity to notice how media shape perception and consciousness. This meant paying attention not just to content, but to form, not just to what was being said, but to how the medium shaped what could be said and how it would be received. McLuhan encouraged what he called a probe approach, making provocative observations and connections designed to jolt perception, to make the familiar strange. His own writing style embodied this approach, leaping between disciplines and historical periods, using puns and paradoxes, refusing conventional academic argumentation. This style was not just idiosyncratic, but rather methodological, an attempt to model the kind of perception needed to see media environments. Another McLuhanian practice is what we might call media fasting, deliberately withdrawing from particular media environments to create contrast and awareness. Just as you cannot really see water if you are always immersed in it, you cannot fully understand a media environment if you never step outside it. By periodically disconnecting from screens, by experiencing silence, by engaging with older media forms like books or face-to-face conversation, we can create the perceptual contrast needed to see what the dominant media environment is doing to consciousness. McLuhan also encouraged studying media history, understanding how consciousness has been shaped differently in different media environments. Reading about oral cultures, manuscript cultures, print cultures, and electronic cultures creates a broader perspective that makes our own media environment less invisible, less natural, more clearly a particular construction with particular effects. When we combine Jungian and McLuhanian practices, we get a more complete discipline of consciousness. We work with dreams and symbols to maintain contact with the archetypal depths. We cultivate critical awareness of media to understand the environments that shape perception from without. We develop the capacity to hold both dimensions in awareness, to see how inner and outer interpenetrate. This combined practice might involve, for instance, paying attention to how our dream life changes in relation to our media use. Do our dreams become more vivid and symbolic when we spend time away from screens? Does intensive social media use affect the quality of our inner life? How do the images we consume through media interact with the images that arise from the unconscious? These questions create bridges between Jungian and McLuhanian awareness, or we might explore how archetypal patterns manifest differently in different media forms. How does the hero's journey appear in oral storytelling versus film versus video games? What aspects of the archetype are emphasized or minimized by different media? How does the medium shape the message of the archetype? This kind of inquiry enriches both our understanding of archetypes and our awareness of media effects. The practice of consciousness that emerges from Jung and McLuhan is fundamentally about developing a more spacious, aware, and responsive relationship to experience. It is about creating some distance from both the archetypal forces that grip us from within and the media environments that shape us from without, not to escape these forces, but to see them more clearly and thus to relate to them more consciously. This practice is not about achieving some final state of perfect consciousness or enlightenment. Both Jung and McLuhan understood that unconsciousness is the default condition, that we are always at risk of being absorbed back into unawareness, of being possessed by archetypes or hypnotized by media. The work of consciousness is ongoing, a lifelong practice rather than a destination to be reached. Moreover, both men understood that consciousness has costs as well as benefits. Becoming conscious often means becoming more aware of suffering, of complexity, of the dark sides of psyche and culture that unconsciousness mercifully veils. Jung spoke of the loneliness of the individuated person, who could no longer simply participate unconsciously in collective identities and beliefs. McLuhan spoke of the anxiety created by awareness of media effects, the loss of naive participation in cultural narratives. Yet both believed these costs were worth bearing because unconsciousness, while often more comfortable, leads ultimately to greater suffering, to neurosis, to projection and scapegoating, to being driven by forces we do not understand toward destinations we did not choose. Consciousness, for all its difficulties, offers the possibility of genuine choice, of authentic relationship with self and world, of participation in the creation of meaning, rather than passive consumption of prefabricated meanings. As we deepen into this contemplative space, it is worth reflecting on what Jung and McLuhan reveal about the nature of the human condition itself. Both men were, in their different ways, philosophers as much as psychologists or communication theorists. They were asking fundamental questions about what it means to be human, about how consciousness works, about our place in the larger order of things. One of their most important shared insights is that human beings are fundamentally symbolic creatures. We do not simply respond to reality directly, but always through the mediation of symbols, internal symbols rising from the archetypal depths, external symbols circulating through media environments. Symbols are not just decorations on the surface of life, but rather the essential medium through which we engage with reality, create meaning, and become who we are. This symbolic nature of human existence means that we are always living at a remove from pure, unmediated reality. There is always interpretation, always mediation, always the shaping influence of symbols. This might seem like a limitation, a barrier between us and reality. But both Jung and McLuhan understood it not as a limitation, but rather as the essential condition of human consciousness, the source of our creativity and meaning-making capacity. Because we are symbolic creatures, we have the capacity to reflect on our own experience, to create narratives about our lives, to see patterns and meanings that transcend immediate circumstance. The archetypal symbols that arise from the collective unconscious connect our personal experience with universal patterns, giving individual life a larger significance. The media symbols that circulate through cultural environments connect us with others, creating shared meanings and collective identities. This symbolic existence is what makes us human in the fullest sense. Animals respond to their environment directly, driven by instinct and immediate perception. Humans live in symbolic worlds of their own, and cultures creation worlds that are psychological and cultural as much as physical. We are the creatures who tell stories, who create myths, who build symbolic structures, temples, and texts and technologies that express and shape our understanding of reality. Both Jung and McLuhan saw the modern world as suffering from a crisis of symbols. The old symbolic systems had broken down or been discredited. Religious symbols that once provided meaning and coherence had lost their power for many people. Traditional mythologies seemed irrelevant to modern life. The rationalist worldview that replaced these older symbolic systems offered clarity and control, but at the cost of meaning and depth. Yet both men also saw possibilities for renewal, for the emergence of new symbolic forms adequate to contemporary consciousness. Jung believed that the psyche was naturally self-regulating, that if old symbols lost their power, new ones would emerge from the unconscious to meet the needs of consciousness. The task was to be attentive to these emerging symbols, to work with them consciously rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. McLuhan believed that the new media environment was creating new forms of symbolic consciousness, new ways of creating and sharing meaning. Electronic media, for all their challenges and dangers, also offered unprecedented possibilities for connection, for participation, for the creation of new forms of collective consciousness. The global village was not just a threat, but also an opportunity, a chance to transcend the limitations of print-based individualism and recover forms of communal participation that had been lost. Their shared hope was that conscious engagement with symbols, both archetypal and mediated, could help humanity navigate the crisis of modernity and create new forms of meaning and connection adequate to our time. This required neither simply returning to old symbolic forms, nor naively embracing whatever new symbols emerged, but rather a conscious, critical, creative relationship with the symbolic dimension of existence. This brings us to perhaps the deepest question raised by Jung and McLuhan. What is the relationship between inner and outer, between psyche and world? Jung's psychology has sometimes been criticized as too subjectivist, as if everything were simply psychological projection and the outer world merely a screen for inner contents. McLuhan's media theory has sometimes been criticized as too deterministic, as if consciousness were simply a product of technological environments and had no autonomy or agency. But neither criticism is fair if we read Jung and McLuhan carefully. Jung, despite his focus on inner psychological reality, never claimed that the outer world was merely subjective. He spent considerable energy developing his concept of synchronicity precisely to account for meaningful connections between psyche and world that could not be explained as either causal relationships or mere subjective projection. He understood that psyche and world interpenetrate, that the boundary between inner and outer is permeable and mysterious. McLuhan, despite his focus on media environments, never claimed that consciousness was simply determined by technology. He emphasized awareness of media effects precisely because he believed that such awareness could create some freedom, some capacity to respond consciously rather than simply being shaped unconsciously. He was not a technological determinist, but rather someone trying to make visible the forces of technological determination so that they could be engaged with consciously. When we hold Jung and McLuhan together, we see that they are describing two aspects of a single reality, the symbolic field in which consciousness exists. This field has both an inner dimension, populated by archetypal patterns arising from the collective unconscious, and an outer dimension, structured by media, environments, and cultural forms. But these are not two separate realities. They are two aspects of a single symbolic matrix that is simultaneously psychological and cultural, internal and external, personal and collective. Consciousness emerges in this field, shaped by both its internal and external dimensions. We are not simply autonomous individuals creating meaning ex nihilo, nor are we simply products of our environment with no agency or interiority. Rather, we exist in a space between, in dynamic relationship with both the archetypal depths within and the symbolic environments without. Our task is to navigate this space consciously, to understand the forces shaping us from both directions, to create meaning that honors both our depth and our context. This understanding has profound implications for questions of agency and freedom. If consciousness is shaped by forces largely outside awareness, archetypal patterns, and media environments, in what sense are we free? How can we speak of genuine choice or authentic individuality? Both Jung and McLuhan would answer that freedom comes through consciousness itself, through awareness of the forces that shape us. When we are unconscious of archetypes and media, we are simply their vehicles, driven by patterns we do not understand. But when we become conscious of these forces, when we can observe them at work, we gain some space, some capacity to respond, rather than simply react. We can never be completely free of archetypal patterns or media effects. They are the conditions of our existence as conscious beings. But we can develop a more conscious relationship with them, and in that consciousness lies our freedom. This is a subtle and demanding form of freedom. It requires constant practice, constant attention, constant willingness to observe our own experience with honesty and courage. It requires accepting that much of what we think of as our autonomous self is actually shaped by forces beyond our control. Yet it also affirms that consciousness itself is real, that awareness matters, that the effort to become more conscious is meaningful and consequential. Both men also shared a sense that this work of consciousness was not just individual but collective, that those who become more aware contribute to the consciousness of humanity as a whole. Jung spoke of this in terms of the collective unconscious, as individuals integrated their personal shadows and developed relationship with archetypal contents. They helped to lighten the burden of unconsciousness carried by the whole species. Each person who chose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over projection, made it slightly easier for others to do the same. McLuhan spoke of this in terms of cultural transformation. Those who understood media effects could help create more humane media environments, could resist the most destructive potentials of technology, could work toward forms of mediation that enhanced rather than diminished human consciousness. By making media effects visible, by teaching others to see what had been invisible, one contributed to the collective capacity to navigate technological change consciously rather than unconsciously. This sense of collective responsibility gives both Jung's and McLuhan's work a profoundly ethical dimension. The work of consciousness is not selfish or merely personal. It is a form of service, a contribution to the whole. Those who undertake this work are, in a sense, doing it on behalf of all humanity, participating in the gradual enlightenment of the species. Yet both men also maintained a realistic, even pessimistic, sense of how difficult this work was and how resistant most people were to consciousness. Jung witnessed how easily entire nations could be possessed by archetypal forces, how readily individuals projected their shadows rather than integrating them. McLuhan observed how unconscious most people were of the media environments, shaping their perception and thought. Neither man was naive about the prospects for widespread enlightenment or rapid transformation of consciousness, but neither despaired. Instead, both dedicated their lives to the work of illumination, to making the unconscious conscious, to bringing awareness to the forces that shaped human experience. They trusted that this work mattered, that each increment of consciousness was valuable, that the long arc of human development moved, however haltingly, toward greater awareness. As we near the end of our contemplation, it is worth considering how Jung and McLuhan might speak to our own moment, to the particular challenges and possibilities we face in the 21st century. What would they make of our world, where media technologies have developed far beyond what McLuhan witnessed, where psychological awareness is more widespread yet perhaps more superficial than what Jung envisioned? Jung would certainly recognize the archetypal dynamics at work in our contemporary world. The political polarization, the tendency toward demonization of the other, the search for scapegoats. These are all signs of shadow projection, of the refusal to integrate the dark sides of both individual and collective psyche. The hunger for meaning that drives people toward conspiracy theories, toward fundamentalisms, toward various forms of ideological possession. This is the same hunger that Jung witnessed, the need for myth and symbol that modernity often fails to satisfy. Jung would also recognize the return of the repressed, the way that content banished from consciousness by rationalism erupts in distorted forms. The fascination with the paranormal, the proliferation of fantasy and mythology in popular culture, the interest in meditation and mindfulness, all these could be seen as evidence that the psyche's need for the symbolic and numinous cannot be permanently suppressed, that it will find outlets one way or another. But Jung might also be encouraged by signs of growing psychological literacy, by the fact that concepts like the shadow, the inner child, and even archetypes have entered common discourse. Even if these concepts are sometimes used superficially, Their presence in cultural conversation suggests a collective intuition that depth matters, that psychology is more than simple behaviorism or biological psychiatry, that the soul has dimensions that need to be honored and explored. McLuhan would recognize the media environment we inhabit as the fulfillment and intensification of trends he identified. The global village has become truly global, with social media connecting billions of people in a vast network of instantaneous communication. The retribalizing effects of electronic media are evident in the formation of online communities, in the resurgence of tribal identities, in the decline of the kind of individualism characteristic of print culture. McLuhan would note how the characteristics of electronic media have become even more pronounced. The cool, participatory nature of media has intensified with social platforms where everyone is both producer and consumer. The multisensory, simultaneous quality of experience has been amplified by devices that integrate text, image, sound, and the tactile dimension of touchscreens. The global, instantaneous nature of communication has created what might be called a planetary nervous system, where events anywhere can have immediate effects everywhere. But McLuhan might also observe with concern how the speed and intensity of media have outpaced our ability to understand their effects. The pace of technological change has been so rapid that we have had little opportunity to develop the kind of awareness he advocated. We are inside the electronic environment to a degree that makes it almost impossible to see it as an environment. The fish is so completely in water that water has become invisible. Yet McLuhan might also see opportunities. The very intensity of our media, saturation has begun to create a counter-movement, a desire for disconnection, for silence, for forms of experience not mediated by screens. The proliferation of practices like digital detox, like mindfulness meditation, like outdoor immersion experiences, these suggest a growing intuition that the media environment needs to be balanced by time outside it, that consciousness requires spaces not completely filled by mediated stimuli. If we imagine Jung and McLuhan in dialogue about our contemporary moment, they might agree on several key points. First, that the symbolic dimension of existence is more rather than less important in our time, despite, or perhaps because of, the dominance of technological rationality. The need for meaning, for depth, for connection to something larger than the individual ego has not been eliminated by modernity, but rather intensified. Second, that the work of consciousness is more urgent than ever. The power of both archetypal forces and technological systems has grown immensely, while awareness of these forces remains limited. The gap between the power of the forces shaping consciousness and our understanding of these forces has widened, creating greater vulnerability to unconscious determination. Third, that the path forward requires neither simply returning to traditional forms nor naively embracing whatever is new, but rather a conscious, critical, creative engagement with both archetypal and mediated dimensions of existence. We need the depth that comes from engaging with the unconscious, with dreams and symbols and myths. We also need the breadth that comes from understanding media environments, from seeing how technologies shape perception and social organization. Fourth, that this work must be both individual and collective. Each person must undertake their own journey of consciousness, their own engagement with the depths within and the environments without. But this individual work always has collective significance, contributing to the consciousness of culture and species as a whole. And collective efforts in education, in cultural criticism, in the design of media environments can support and enhance individual development. Finally, both Jung and McLuhan might remind us that consciousness is not a burden to be borne, but a gift to be celebrated, a capacity that makes us uniquely human. Yes, consciousness brings suffering, brings awareness of the tragic dimensions of existence, but it also brings beauty, meaning, the possibility of genuine freedom and authentic relationship. The examined life, for all its difficulties, is richer and more fully human than the unexamined life. As we complete our journey through the intertwining paths of Jung and McLuhan, we might rest in the space between their visions, in that fertile territory where depth, psychology, and media theory meet. This is the space where consciousness exists, shaped by forces from within and without, from depths and surfaces, from timeless archetypes and time-bound technologies. In this space, we are neither simply autonomous individuals nor simply products of our environment. We are beings in relationship with the unconscious, with culture, with each other, with the technologies we create and that create us. Our task is to inhabit this space consciously, to navigate between the archetypal depths that Jung mapped and the media environments that McLuhan described, to bring awareness to both dimensions of our existence. This is delicate work, requiring patience and persistence. It means attending to our dreams while also observing our media use. It means engaging with ancient myths while also understanding contemporary technologies. It means honoring both the universal patterns in the collective unconscious and the particular circumstances of our historical moment. It means developing a double consciousness that can hold both the timeless and the timely, both the eternal and the contemporary. The conversation between Jung and McLuhan continues, not just in academic discourse, but in the lived experience of anyone who seeks to understand consciousness in our media-saturated, psychologically complex world. Their dialogue offers resources for this understanding, tools for navigating the symbolic terrain where we actually live. Jung gives us permission to honor depth, to trust that dreams mean something, that symbols carry weight, that the unconscious is not just a repository of personal repressions, but a connection to something vast and transpersonal. He reminds us that we are more than our conscious egos, that there are dimensions of our being that transcend individual biography, that participating in the archetypal patterns of human experience connects us to the entire human journey across time. McLuhan gives us permission to question the obvious, to see the invisible structures that shape perception, to recognize that technologies are not neutral tools, but powerful forces that reshape consciousness itself. He reminds us that we are immersed in symbolic environments of collective creation, that culture is not just background, but actively constitutive of consciousness, that understanding these environments is essential to understanding ourselves. Together, they invite us into a more spacious awareness, one that can hold both the vertical dimension of depth and the horizontal dimension of cultural context, both the archetypal and the mediated, both the eternal and the historical. This awareness does not resolve all paradoxes or answer all questions. Instead, it creates a more conscious relationship with paradox and question, a capacity to live with complexity and uncertainty while continuing to seek understanding and meaning. As this story winds to its close, as your consciousness drifts between waking and sleeping, Let the images and ideas we have explored settle into the spaces between thoughts. The figures of Jung and McLuhan, each in their own way a cartographer of consciousness, have shown us territories within and without, have pointed toward the invisible forces that shape visible experience. You need not remember every detail, every concept, every comparison. Instead, let the essential insight sink deeper that consciousness exists in a field of symbols shaped by forces from depth and surface, that awareness of these forces brings a measure of freedom, that the examined life lived consciously is the most fully human life available to us. The work of consciousness continues in each moment, in each choice to notice rather than remain oblivious, to reflect rather than simply react, to engage rather than be engaged. This work is never complete, never perfected, always requiring renewal. But it is work that connects us to something larger than ourselves, to the human project of becoming conscious, of bringing light to darkness, of transforming the unconscious into the conscious through the difficult grace of fording freeze awareness. Sleep now, if sleep comes, with Jung's archetypes and McLuhan's media swirling together in the symbolic space of consciousness. Dream your own dreams, which will draw from depths that both men explored and from surfaces that continue to shift and shimmer with each new technology, each new cultural form. And when you wake, perhaps something of this exploration will remain, a residue of understanding, a shift in how you perceive the symbolic world you inhabit, a slightly greater capacity to navigate between the interior depths and the exterior environments that together constitute the territory of human consciousness. The dialogue between great minds never ends. It simply continues in each person who encounters their work, each consciousness that attempts to integrate their insights. You are part of this dialogue now, part of the ongoing conversation between depth and surface, psyche and culture, archetype and medium. May this conversation enrich your awareness, deepen your understanding, and support your own journey toward greater consciousness. Rest well in the knowledge that consciousness matters, that awareness is meaningful, that the effort to understand the forces shaping experience is not futile, but rather essential to being fully human. And know that in attending to both the symbols within and the media without, you participate in the work that Jung and McLuhan dedicated their lives to, the illumination of consciousness, the making visible of what shapes us invisibly, the transformation of darkness into light through the difficult and sacred work of becoming aware